If you close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself drifting back to the late 19th century, you might see Russia as a vast painting, wide, beautiful, and cold, but hiding deep cracks beneath its surface. It was an empire that stretched across continents, filled with glittering palaces, icy forests, wooden villages, and cities where aristocrats danced under golden chandeliers. But behind the shimmering exterior, something was quietly decaying. Russian society at that time was like a grand mansion built on soft, sinking ground, solid on the outside, unstable within. Peasants made up the majority of the population, yet lived lives of endless poverty. In the new industrial cities, factory workers labored 14 to 16 hours a day in harsh, dangerous conditions. Meanwhile, intellectuals whispered in private rooms about justice, reform, and the idea that no emperor, not even the mighty Tsar, should hold absolute power. And it was into this restless world that a small boy was born in 1870 in the quiet town of Simbirsk. His name was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, though the world would later remember him as Lenin, a man whose ideas would divide nations and redraw the map of the 20th century. A family of discipline and ideas. Vladimir grew up in a family that valued learning above all else. His father, Ilya Ulyanov, worked as an educator for the imperial government, a strict but fair man who believed deeply in order, duty, and knowledge. His mother, Maria Alexandrovna, came from a family of scholars. She filled their home with books, reading circles, and thoughtful discussions about literature and science. The Ulyanov home wasn't wealthy in the glamorous sense, but it was rich in something more lasting: ideas. Every dinner felt like a small lesson. The children listened as their parents talked about philosophy, history, and the world beyond their town. In that warm, book-filled house, young Vladimir learned to question, to observe, and to think for himself. The town of Simbirsk sat beside the slow-moving Volga River, surrounded by long winters and quiet days. To many, it was an ordinary place. But inside one of the houses, a seed was being planted. A seed that would one day grow into a vision capable of shaking the world. A childhood of discipline and difference. From a young age, Vladimir was unlike other children. He spoke little, listened closely, and possessed a focus that surprised even his teachers. They said he had a mind sharp as a blade, but calm as autumn water. He mastered lessons quickly and quietly, often finishing work before others had even begun. But the Ulyanov family did not raise their children to be arrogant or detached. They taught them to pay attention to the world outside their window, to see injustice, poverty, and the suffering of ordinary people. And outside the peaceful walls of their home, Russia was changing rapidly. Whispers of revolt traveled from village to village. Small groups of thinkers met in secret rooms to discuss forbidden ideas: democracy, equality, and the possibility of a society without tyranny. Illegal pamphlets circulated in the shadows. Many intellectuals believed that peaceful reform was impossible under Tsarist rule. No one could predict the future. But one event would change the Ulyanov family forever, and turn Vladimir's quiet, disciplined mind into something far more determined. A death that changed everything. Vladimir's older brother, Alexander Ulyanov, was the pride of the family. Gentle, brilliant, and admired, Alexander was everything a promising young man of the Russian intelligentsia was expected to be. But as he grew, he became troubled by the injustice he saw around him. He joined student groups who debated politics passionately, trying to imagine a better future for their country. Russia at the time was tense, suffocating under the rule of Tsar Alexander III. Many young radicals believed that the only way to spark change was through violent action. Gradually, Alexander was drawn into a group that planned to assassinate the Tsar. He was not the one who held the bomb, but he participated in the planning, and that was enough. The plan failed. The conspirators were arrested, and Alexander, the thoughtful, soft-spoken young man, was sentenced to death. When the news reached the Ulyanov household, grief washed over them like a cold, endless tide. Their mother fainted. Their father wept openly, something no one had ever seen him do. And Vladimir, just 17 years old, stood frozen, staring into an emptiness only he could see. On the day Alexander was hanged, Vladimir did not cry. He simply changed. It was as if a door had opened inside him. A door leading not to despair, but to a deeper, more relentless resolve. For many families, such a tragedy would have signaled the end of hope. But for Vladimir, it became a beginning. The seeds of a restless mind. After his brother's execution, Vladimir Ulyanov transformed. The quiet boy with perfect grades became a young man with sharp, unshakable purpose. He wanted to understand what had driven Alexander, not just emotionally, but logically, scientifically. What kind of society pushes gentle young men toward desperate acts? Why do systems of power crush some people and spare others? Is there a better way, a structured, reasoned way to change the world? Vladimir threw himself into reading. Not just literature and school books, but the forbidden works of political thinkers. Among them, one author stood out, Karl Marx. Where Alexander had acted out of passion and moral outrage, Vladimir saw in Marx something different. A blueprint, a method, a disciplined theory of revolution. If his brother had been a spark that burned too quickly, Vladimir wanted to become a fire that would not die. One winter evening, as snow drifted outside his window, he wrote a line that foreshadowed his future. We must live not only to mourn, but to understand and to change. From that moment, Vladimir Ulyanov stepped onto a path that would one day transform him into Lenin, a man whose vision would shatter an empire, inspire millions, and divide the world for generations to come. And this was only the beginning. When Vladimir Ulyanov stepped into young adulthood, he carried with him the weight of his brother's death and the quiet determination that had taken hold afterward. But grief alone does not create a revolutionary. It takes time, pressure, and the right environment to shape a mind that can challenge an empire. And for Lenin, the shaping began in a place that was supposed to represent opportunity and growth, Kazan University. A young man enters a new world. In 1887, at just 17, Vladimir traveled to the city of Kazan, where he would begin his studies in law. Kazan was a world away from Simbirsk, larger, louder, and filled with political tensions bubbling just beneath the surface. Students whispered in corridors, discussed forbidden ideas in darkened rooms, and argued passionately about the future of Russia. For Vladimir, the campus was a doorway into a world of intense intellectual energy. But it was also a world under constant surveillance. After the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, the imperial government tightened its control over universities. Student gatherings were monitored, and any hint of political activism was swiftly punished. Still, the desire for change simmered everywhere. The expulsion that sparked something deeper. Only a few months after enrolling, Vladimir found himself drawn into a student protest, a demonstration not of violence, but of defiance. Students gathered to demand basic rights, freedom of assembly, fair treatment, and the chance to speak without fear. For the authorities, however, even peaceful protest was unacceptable. Vladimir did not lead the demonstration. In fact, he hardly spoke during it. But in Tsarist Russia, being present was enough. He was arrested and expelled from the university. He was 17 years old and already branded a troublemaker. But, for Vladimir, the expulsion did something unexpected. It carved away the last illusions he might have had about reform, compromise, or gentle progress. If education, the path of reason, knowledge, and self-improvement, could be denied simply because one stood near a peaceful protest, then something in Russia was deeply, fundamentally broken. He returned home, not defeated, but hardened. A door had closed, and another, more dangerous one had opened. A life of books, snow, and silent determination. During this period of forced return to Simbirsk, Vladimir turned inward. He could not attend classes, he could not walk the university halls, he could not debate with other students, but he could do one thing, something that would shape the rest of his life. He could read, and he read with an intensity that astonished everyone around him. Day after day, while winter winds shook the windows and the Volga River froze into silence, Vladimir sat hunched over books. Philosophy, economics, history, politics, he devoured them all. But among these works, one author rose above the rest and captured his mind entirely: Karl Marx. Marx's writings were banned in Russia, but banned books have a way of finding their readers. When Vladimir opened Capital and the Communist Manifesto, something clicked inside him, as if the scattered pieces of his grief, anger, and confusion fell into perfect alignment. Marx offered not just criticism, but structure. Not just outrage, but explanation. Not just rebellion, but a blueprint. The world, according to Marx, was not a meaningless swirl of suffering and injustice. It had patterns, laws, and forces beneath its surface. And at the center of everything was the struggle between classes: those who worked and those who controlled the work of others. For Vladimir, this was more than theory. It was revelation. The foundation of a new philosophy. As months passed, Marx's ideas became the foundation of Vladimir's worldview, the solid ground he felt Russia lacked. He began to see history as a series of stages, each shaped by conflict between economic classes. And in this great unfolding story of human societies, Marx identified a single force capable of reshaping the world: the working class, the proletariat. Factory workers, miners, peasants forced into industrial labor. They were not simply victims of the system. They were, potentially, its destroyers and rebuilders. They had the numbers. They had the struggle. And most importantly, they had nothing to lose. This idea ignited something powerful in Vladimir. If Russia was to be transformed, truly, fundamentally transformed, it would not be through the actions of nobles or intellectuals alone. It would be through the rising consciousness of millions of ordinary people. And the more he read, the clearer his mission became. A vision begins to form. People who knew Vladimir at this time described him as calm, almost too calm, a young man who rarely displayed emotion, even when speaking about the injustices of the world. But beneath that calm surface, something vast and determined was forming. A vision. He began to write notes, underline passages, fill margins with thoughts. He debated with himself in private, refining ideas like a craftsman sharpening a blade, and slowly, the outline of a lifetime mission emerged. If Russia could not be changed from above, then it must be changed from below. If the old world could not reform itself, then a new one had to be built. And if Alexander's death was a tragedy without direction, Vladimir's life would be a revolution with purpose. He no longer saw the working class as just a suffering majority. He saw them as the engine of history, the force that would push Russia toward a new destiny. The quiet before the storm. In those years of reading and reflection, Vladimir created the intellectual foundation of the man he would become, Lenin. Yet no storms appeared on the horizon just yet. From the outside, he was simply a young man preparing to retake university exams, and continue studying law. But on the inside, he was constructing a new worldview brick by brick. Disciplined, methodical, and unwavering. The fire that had consumed his brother had become something different within him. Not a burst of passion, but a sustained, calculated flame. A flame that would soon spread far beyond Russia's borders. Something was awakening in Russia and in Vladimir Ulyanov himself. The birth of a revolutionary mind had begun. When Vladimir Ulyanov stood before the imperial authorities in the early 1890s, the decision had already been made. His writings, his meetings with small circles of revolutionaries, and his growing defiance of Tsarist control marked him as a dangerous thinker. But the empire did not want another martyr like his brother Alexander. Instead, they handed down a punishment that was intended to break the young scholar quietly. 3 years of exile in Siberia. To most people, Siberia was a death sentence wrapped in politeness. Not execution, but erasure. A place where cold winds erased footsteps and years vanished into white silence. But for Vladimir, exile would become something else entirely. A workshop of ideas, a crucible for discipline, and the birthplace of a strategy that would one day shake the world. Into the frozen horizon, Siberia greeted him with a kind of beauty that felt both majestic and merciless. Snow stretched across the land like a blank sheet of paper. Forests of dark, skeletal trees lined the horizon, their branches groaning under the weight of ice. Days were short, nights longer than memory, and silence filled the spaces where human voices rarely lingered. Most exiles fell into despair here. Some drank to escape the loneliness, others lost their sense of purpose entirely. But Vladimir was different. The cold sharpened his mind. The isolation cleared away distractions, and the vast, frozen quiet gave him something he had never truly possessed before. Time. Time to think, to read, to refine his vision. Time to turn anger into theory. Time to turn theory into strategy. A life of iron routines. While many exiles drifted aimlessly, Vladimir built his days with mathematical discipline. He woke early each morning, even when the cold made rising a small act of defiance. He wrote for hours, read for hours more, and filled notebooks with reflections on economics, politics, and the mechanics of revolution. This was the period when the world began to notice the unusual rhythm of his character. Everything he did was deliberate. Every action had purpose. Lenin, though he did not yet use that name, lived as if the revolution might arrive tomorrow, and he must be ready. Observers later described his routine in Siberia as iron, as though he had forged a structure around himself so rigid that the cold could not penetrate it. He exercised daily in the snow. He enforced strict reading schedules. He wrote as if every sentence were a soldier preparing for battle. And, in a sense, they were. For the ideas he developed during these years of exile would eventually become weapons, not of violence, but of organization, clarity, and conviction. The seeds of a theory, what is to be done. It was in this frozen exile that Vladimir began shaping the work that would define his early revolutionary identity. A theory on how to build a disciplined, unstoppable movement, later known as What is to be Done. To understand the importance of this text, one must imagine Russia at the time. Revolutionary groups existed, but they were scattered, emotional, and often spontaneous. Students protested when inspired. Workers rebelled when pushed too far. Intellectuals argued endlessly in circles. But the Tsar's government remained intact because it was organized, forceful, and merciless. Vladimir concluded something radical. A revolution cannot rely on passion alone. It must be organized. It must be disciplined. It must strike with precision. This insight became the heart of his future strategy. In his notebooks, he wrote and rewrote the idea that would later shake the revolutionary world, a successful revolution requires a tightly unified, highly trained group of professional revolutionaries. Individuals who dedicate their entire lives to the cause. Not amateurs, not dreamers, but a vanguard. A disciplined core that would lead the masses, educate them, and channel their anger into a focused, strategic movement. This was the first spark of what would later become the Bolshevik Party, the birth of an iron idealist. During exile, Vladimir also forged something within himself, a blend of steel-like determination and unwavering belief. He read not only Marx, but also history, military strategy, philosophy, and biographies of leaders across centuries. He analyzed how revolutions failed, how empires sustained themselves, and how human psychology responded to fear and hope. What emerged from this period was a new kind of thinker. Not just a philosopher, not just a critic of society, but an engineer of political change. An engineer who believed, firmly and irrevocably, that ideas alone were not enough. They required infrastructure, they required loyalty. They required human beings disciplined enough to carry them through chaos. Lenin's exile did not soften him. It hardened him. It shaped him into a man who believed that the path to justice was not gentle, but strategic. In the deep Siberian winter, his ideals froze into something sharp, enduring, and almost unbreakable. A circle of comrades. Despite the isolation, Vladimir was not entirely alone. Among the exiles in the region were other intellectuals, activists, and thinkers. He found people who had also fallen under the suspicion of the Tsarist regime. In their sparse wooden cottages, small groups gathered around flickering lanterns to discuss the future of Russia. Many of these exiles were earnest and intelligent, but also scattered in their beliefs. Some favored gradual reform, others imagined peasant uprisings, and still others dreamed of a spontaneous revolution led by moral outrage. Vladimir listened carefully, patiently, and then he challenged them. Where they saw emotion, he saw structure. Where they saw possibility, he saw necessity. Where they debated endlessly, he cut through with clarity. Gradually, a few began to see the world through his eyes. Not many, but enough. They recognized in Vladimir a mind that did not merely hope for revolution, but planned for it. These early alliances, formed in the cold of Siberia, were the first threads of a network that would one day become the Bolsheviks, the faction of the majority, but more importantly, the faction of discipline, the philosophy of discipline. One of the most defining features of Lenin's character took shape in Siberia. His belief that discipline was not the enemy of freedom, but its foundation. He saw how disorganized movements fell apart. He saw how passion flickered and burned out. He saw how governments exploited chaos. And he concluded that if the oppressed were to triumph, they must develop a discipline stronger than the system that oppressed them. This belief would later shape the entire structure of the Bolshevik movement. Strict membership rules, centralized leadership, and unwavering loyalty to the cause. To some, it looked harsh. To Lenin, it was survival. A new word for the world, Bolshevik. By the end of his exile, Vladimir had refined the concepts that would guide him for the rest of his life. A vanguard party, professional revolutionaries, ideological unity, strict discipline, leadership capable of directing the working class. These ideas would soon coalesce into a political faction called the Bolsheviks, meaning the majority. Though, ironically, they were not truly the majority at first. What mattered was not numbers, but organization. Not enthusiasm, but endurance. Lenin believed that the working class, the masses of laborers in factories and fields, would ultimately drive the revolution. But he also believed they needed guidance, strategy, and leadership. And so the Bolsheviks were born not from sudden inspiration, but from years of cold contemplation in the Siberian wilderness, the end of exile, and the beginning of strategy. When Vladimir finally left Siberia, the world had changed, but so had he. He walked out not as a dream-filled youth, but as a strategist with a clear mission. The snow had carved him into something sharper, a man ready to transform ideas into action. Exile had given him silence, and he filled that silence with theory. Exile had given him isolation, and he turned that isolation into discipline. Exile had given him time, and he shaped that time into strategy. A strategy that would soon challenge the greatest empire on Earth. And the storm he was preparing would not simply seek reform. It would seek to remake the world. When Lenin stepped out of Siberia and into Europe in the late 1890s, he entered a continent humming with energy, ideas, and contradictions. Vienna, Geneva, Munich, Paris, Zurich. These cities became temporary homes as he drifted between them like a restless scholar searching for the heart of revolution. Each place offered something new. Newspapers packed with fierce political debates, cafes filled with intellectuals, libraries stacked with the latest economic theories, and streets alive with workers demanding recognition. Europe was modern, electric, buzzing with new technology and bold ideas. But beneath that excitement, something darker pulsed. Nations competed for colonies, industries raced to outproduce one another, and emperors measured their armies like chess pieces. The continent felt like a grand theater, its curtains slowly rising on a tragedy no one yet understood. Into this charged atmosphere walked Vladimir Lenin, not yet the world-famous leader, but a determined, sharp-eyed revolutionary carrying notebooks, pamphlets, and a vision forged in the snows of Siberia. A life, written in newspapers. For Lenin, Europe was not a place to rest. It was a laboratory for building the revolution. He spent hours in reading rooms, absorbing newspapers from every corner of the continent. He studied economic trends, analyzed strikes, compared ideologies, and scribbled critiques in margins that grew thick with ink. But he wasn't just reading newspapers, he was producing them. Lenin believed that a revolution needed more than slogans. It needed education, clarity, and a voice capable of reaching workers across borders. And so, he founded and contributed to underground newspapers and journals, the most famous being Iskra, meaning the spark. He dreamed that a single spark could set fire to the old world, spreading from one mind to another until change became unstoppable. Working on Iskra was grueling. Lenin wrote articles late into the night, edited submissions from comrades, coordinated secret distribution networks across Russia, and raised funds tirelessly. He traveled between safe houses, always alert to the threat of czarist spies. There was never enough money, never enough ink, never enough time, but there was always purpose. And that purpose was clear: to create an intellectual foundation strong enough to ignite a revolution. Political analysis as a daily ritual. While living in Switzerland, Lenin developed a daily ritual. Every morning, he walked to the local library, a quiet building with tall windows and rows of wooden tables. There, he would sit for hours, surrounded by stacks of newspapers from France, Germany, Britain, and Russia. He read everything: economic statistics, announcements from trade unions, reports of worker strikes, military spending data, and political speeches. To Lenin, newspapers were not just news. They were clues, patterns, signals. He analyzed them the way a scientist studies the movement of stars, searching for patterns that could predict both crisis and opportunity. When he read about a strike in Germany, he compared it to agricultural unrest in Russia. When he saw debates in the British Parliament, he looked for signs of divisions within the ruling classes. When he read about rising military budgets in Austria-Hungary, he sensed tension that could one day explode. Over time, Lenin developed a startling conclusion. Europe was drifting toward a massive war, a war that would shake the foundations of every nation on the continent. The storm before the storm. By the early 20th century, war clouds darkened Europe's skies like a gathering winter storm. Everywhere Lenin traveled, he saw evidence of the coming conflict. Factories were producing weapons at unprecedented rates. Politicians spoke of national pride with feverish intensity. Empires formed alliances not out of trust, but out of fear. In Vienna, Lenin wrote that Europe felt like a warehouse filled with explosives, waiting for a single spark. In Paris, he saw crowds cheering their generals. In Berlin, he watched soldiers march in perfect lines through the streets, their boots striking the ground like war drums. Ordinary people sensed it too. Workers whispered about rumors of mobilization. Women stocked food. Men talked about borders and enemies they had never seen. Everywhere Lenin looked, he saw movement toward conflict. But while others trembled or cheered, Lenin saw something different, an opportunity. War as the catalyst of revolution. To many, war was horror. To Lenin, war was transformation. He believed that a global conflict would expose the weaknesses of every empire, especially Russia's. The Tsarist government, already fragile under economic pressure and simmering social unrest, would be pushed to breaking point by war. Soldiers, facing hunger and death, would question the orders forced upon them. Workers, suffering shortages and longer hours, would lose their faith in the system. Lenin's views was not born from cruelty, but from cold analysis. He believed that only when people saw the full brutality of the empire would they demand something better. He wrote, "War will accelerate the collapse of the old order. It will strip away illusions. It will force the masses to see the truth." In his mind, war was not a tragedy to be avoided at all costs. It was a historical engine, grinding old structures into dust so new ones could rise. Fundraising and building the international network. For his vision to become reality, Lenin needed more than theories. He needed a network of allies and resources. So while traveling across Europe, he met with socialist leaders from Germany, France, Britain, and Italy. He debated with them in smoky rooms, sat across from them in cafes crowded with activists, and wrote letters that crossed borders faster than police could intercept them. He argued fiercely. He persuaded where he could. He challenged where he must. And slowly, he built something that had never truly existed before: an international revolutionary movement with Russia at its center. Raising money was a constant struggle. Lenin gave speeches, organized fundraisers, and convinced supporters that their coins and banknotes were not donations, but investments in the future of humanity. Every mark, franc, or ruble went toward printing presses, underground networks, and the wages of the professional revolutionaries he believed were essential to success. The psalm before the explosion. By 1914, the air in Europe was thick with tension. Lenin could almost feel the continent holding its breath. One assassination, one border skirmish, one diplomatic failure. That was all it would take to set the world on fire. And then, in June 1914, it happened. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. The spark. Soon nations declared war in a chain reaction that felt inevitable. Europe marched toward destruction with a grim determination that chilled even the bravest hearts. As millions prepared to fight, Lenin sat in a cramped Swiss apartment, surrounded by newspapers whose headlines screamed "War" in a dozen languages. He did not celebrate, but he did not despair. Instead, he whispered a quiet realization, one that had taken him years to articulate. History is accelerating. He believed the war would tear open the cracks in society and reveal the truth that had been building for decades. For the first time, he saw clearly the path that might lead from chaos to revolution. A vision, sharpened by conflict war, to Lenin was not the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a moment when oppression could be confronted, when workers could rise, when the great empires of Europe could crumble under their own weight. His writings during these years became sharper, more urgent, and more prophetic. He urged socialists around the world not to support their own governments in the war, but to turn the conflict into a revolution. He argued that soldiers should not fight each other, but instead rebel against the leaders who had sent them to die. This idea shocked many. It inspired others, and it set Lenin apart as a thinker willing to challenge not only empires, but even his own allies. In Europe's darkest moment, Lenin's clarity grew brighter, preparing for the inevitable. As the war raged on, Lenin worked tirelessly. He wrote essays predicting the collapse of the Russian Empire. He sent instructions to comrades operating secretly inside Russia. He strengthened his network, refined his strategy, and waited. For Lenin, waiting was not passive, it was preparation. He believed that when the moment finally came, when war, hunger, and despair pushed the Russian people to their breaking point, the Bolsheviks had to be ready. Ready to lead, ready to organize, ready to seize the opportunity that history would deliver. And so, in the cafes of Geneva, the libraries of Paris, and the cluttered rooms of Zurich, Lenin crafted not just arguments, but a vision for a new world. A world he believed was drawing closer with each cannon fired on the battlefields of Europe. The storm had broken. History was in motion, and Lenin was preparing to step into its center. By early 1917, Europe had been burning for nearly 3 years. The First World War was devouring nations, swallowing millions of lives, and reshaping borders with every passing season. Russia, strained by hunger, military defeat, and political incompetence, trembled on the edge of collapse. And somewhere in Switzerland, far from the trenches and the crumbling front lines, Vladimir Lenin waited for a moment he had foreseen long before others dared imagine it. One cold March morning, a knock came at his door. Breathless, a comrade delivered the news that swept across Europe like a gust of wind. The Tsar had fallen. The Romanov dynasty was over. The Russian Empire had collapsed under its own weight. For Lenin, the moment was electrifying. Everything he had predicted, the war breaking the old order, the masses rising up, the government faltering, was happening. But he also understood something others did not. The revolution was only half-formed, fragile, dangerously incomplete. Russia had removed the Tsar, but the new provisional government still planned to continue the war, still protected private property, still refused to hand power to the workers and soldiers. If I do not return now, Lenin told his comrades, the revolution will be lost. Yet returning to Russia was no simple task. The war had sealed borders, armies patrolled railways, and Europe's nations distrusted exiles who seemed too eager to exploit the chaos. But Lenin was determined, and history was preparing one of its most dramatic scenes. The sealed train Germany, Russia's enemy in the war, saw an opportunity in Lenin's desperation. If they could help him return to Russia, perhaps he would spread unrest, weaken the Russian war effort, and force the Eastern Front to collapse. And so, after tense negotiations, a strange agreement was reached. Lenin would be allowed to travel across Germany in a sealed train, a train he could not leave, and no German official could enter. It was a diplomatic fiction, a symbolic quarantine. The passengers would be treated as if they were not truly on German soil. Lenin accepted. Revolutionaries were accustomed to contradictions. On April 9, 1917, Lenin boarded the small, cramped train car with 31 other exiles. The windows were shuttered. Guards stood watch outside, ensuring no one escaped and no one approached. Inside, the passengers debated politics, wrote notes, and rehearsed the speeches they might give upon arriving in Petrograd. Lenin, however, remained focused, pacing back and forth, mapping out the future in his mind. He knew that every hour counted. The revolution in Russia was moving quickly, and history rarely opened its doors twice. As the sealed train rattled across Germany, Europe's war-torn landscapes flashed past, ruined towns, crowded military hospitals, endless lines of soldiers. Lenin watched from behind the shutters, absorbing everything. He saw not just destruction, but confirmation. The war was the engine of collapse he'd predicted, and Russia, now leaderless and broken, was the place where the old world might finally shatter completely. Crossing borders, crossing eras. The journey took days. At every border, the train was met with suspicion, argument, and bureaucratic resistance. But slowly, methodically, it made its way north. Through Germany, across the Baltic Sea, into neutral Sweden, then Finland, still a territory of the Russian Empire, but trembling with its own political tensions. At each stop, crowds gathered to glimpse the mysterious train with its strange, silent passengers. Rumors spread. Lenin is returning. The revolution will change course. No one knows what will happen next. By the time Lenin neared Petrograd, the news of his return had become a storm. Petrograd in chaos. On the evening of April 16, 1917, Lenin's train pulled into the Finland station. Petrograd, the capital of a collapsing empire, was a city of long bread lines, exhausted soldiers, and factories filled with restless workers. Posters crowded every wall, some demanding peace, others calling for reform, still others urging continued resistance against Germany. Soldiers wandered without orders. Workers held spontaneous meetings in the streets. Former subjects of the Tsar now argued politics at tram stops. It was a city in transition, suspended between the old world and the new, unsure which way history would turn. When Lenin stepped onto the platform, torchlight flickered across his face. A crowd of supporters, Bolsheviks, soldiers, workers, students, roared his name. They had expected a hero returning home. Instead, they found a short, intense man with penetrating eyes and a sense of urgency that seemed almost frightening. Lenin climbed atop an armored car and began to speak. His voice, sharp and unwavering, cut through the night. He did not congratulate the provisional government. He did not celebrate Russia's freedom. He did not praise moderation, compromise, or patience. Instead, he declared, "No support for the provisional government. All power must go to the Soviets." The crowd froze. These words were radical even among revolutionaries. Many had hoped the provisional government would guide Russia toward democracy. They believed in cooperation, gradual reform, shared responsibility. Lenin rejected all of it. He believed the revolution was not complete. It had barely begun. The April Theses. Within days of his arrival, Lenin wrote what became one of the most influential political documents of the 20th century, the April Theses. Written quickly but with surgical precision, the Theses were not a speech, not a manifesto, but a blueprint. A plan for overturning the provisional government and transferring power directly to the workers and soldiers organized in local councils called Soviets. In the April Theses, Lenin called for immediate end to the war, redistribution of land to peasants, nationalization of banks and major industries, transfer of all political authority to the Soviets, creation of a revolutionary vanguard party to lead the movement. Overthrow of the existing government, peacefully if possible, forcefully if necessary. For many revolutionaries, the April theses were shocking. Even members of Lenin's own party, the Bolsheviks, were hesitant. Russia was exhausted. People wanted stability. Yet Lenin insisted that stability was an illusion. The provisional government would not end the war, would not address hunger, and would not grant real power to the people. He argued that history had delivered a rare moment. A moment when an entire society was suspended in uncertainty, when the structures of the old world had cracked wide open. And if revolutionaries did not seize that moment, it would vanish. A city in the balance. In Petrograd, Lenin moved swiftly. He met with workers' councils, soldiers' committees, party members, and sympathetic intellectuals. His presence energized some, terrified others, and unsettled many. But no one could ignore him. Factories buzzed with his ideas. Barracks echoed with debates about war, peace, and power. Newspapers printed his words, sparking arguments across the city. Lenin was not simply offering opinions, he was giving people a path, a sense of direction in a moment of profound confusion. But he also understood the danger. The provisional government had its supporters, generals, former nobles, business leaders, moderate socialists, and officers who feared chaos almost as much as they feared revolution. In the shadows, they whispered, "Lenin is dangerous. He is pushing us toward civil war. He must be stopped." A blueprint for overthrow. The April theses became the Bolsheviks' guiding document. Under Lenin's leadership, the party shifted from cautious analysis to bold action. It became a disciplined force with clear objectives. Win the support of workers. Convince soldiers to abandon the provisional government. Prepare for the next phase of revolution. Lenin argued that only decisive action could prevent the revolution from being stolen by moderates or destroyed by reactionaries. To him, history was a river in flood, powerful, unpredictable, and merciless. Those who hesitated would drown. And so, the sealed train that had carried Lenin across Europe became more than a journey. It became a symbol, a line drawn across time, separating the old world from the new. Within months, his ideas would ignite to the next stage of the Russian Revolution, a stage that would change Russia forever, a stage that would echo across the century, a stage that no one, not even Lenin, could fully control once unleashed. The city trembled, the government wavered, and the revolution waited, quietly, for its next command. By the middle of 1917, Russia was standing on a trembling bridge between two eras. Behind it lay a world of czars, palaces, and centuries of unquestioned power. Ahead lay something unclear, undefined, and yet to be shaped. A world that millions hoped would bring peace, equality, and justice. But history rarely transitions quietly. The provisional government, formed after the fall of the Romanovs, struggled to hold the country together. Russia was exhausted from war, starving from shortages, and shaken by constant strikes. Soldiers deserted the front lines in staggering numbers. Peasants seized land without permission. Workers seized factories without waiting for legal approval. In the middle of the storm, Lenin stood like a man watching a dam crack, waiting for the precise moment when pressure would burst it wide open. That moment came in October. The slow collapse of the old regime. Though the Tsar had abdicated months earlier, the old world had not truly fallen. Power still rested in the hands of ministers who believed Russia could continue fighting the war. Generals still barked orders as if soldiers were unbreakable. Landowners still expected peasants to obey. Capitalists still believed factories belonged to them, even as workers risked their lives to keep production moving. But beneath these old structures, something fundamental had shifted. The people no longer believed. To peasants, the provisional government felt like another distant authority demanding sacrifices. To workers, it felt like a continuation of the same injustice under a different name. To soldiers, it felt like betrayal, another set of leaders sending them into mud and gunfire. The power of a government, Lenin always said, does not exist in its buildings or statues. It exists only in the belief of the people. And in 1917, that belief was fading fast. The Bolsheviks' rise. While the provisional government hesitated, Lenin acted. He returned to Russia not as an outsider, whispering ideas, but as a force capable of reshaping the entire revolutionary landscape. His message was direct: end the war. Give land to the peasants. Give power to the Soviets, the councils of workers and soldiers. These ideas were not subtle. They were not academic. They were answers, simple, decisive, and urgent, to the suffering that millions experienced every day. By summer, the Bolsheviks' influence had spread through factories, naval bases, and army barracks. Workers saw in Lenin someone willing to push for immediate change. Soldiers saw in him the promise of peace. Peasants saw the hope of land reform. And the provisional government? It saw a threat, but one it underestimated. The tipping point. In September 1917, a failed military coup by General Kornilov shook Russia even further. Soldiers and workers rose to stop the coup, and in doing so, they placed weapons and authority in the hands of the Bolsheviks. Trust shifted. Momentum shifted. The balance of power shifted. Lenin, hidden in a safe house and writing furiously, sent message after message to the Bolshevik leadership. History will not forgive us if we do not act now. He believed the window for revolution was narrow, and if they hesitated, another regime, perhaps even more conservative, would seize control. He urged one thing: an armed uprising. The night of October 25th, 1917 to Petrograd, wrapped in cold autumn air, it braced for something no one could fully predict. Streetcar bells clanged in the distance. Workers hurried home with bread rations. Soldiers stood at checkpoints wearing worn coats and tired expressions. Few knew that within hours, the city would witness one of the most famous events in modern history. Under Lenin's direction, though often secretly from hiding, the Bolsheviks coordinated their forces. Red Guards took control of telegraph stations. Sailors seized bridges. Workers took over train stations. Soldiers loyal to the Soviets quietly surrounded the Winter Palace, where the provisional government was meeting. Despite the dramatic images later painted by propaganda, the October Revolution was not a roaring storm of gunfire. It was methodical, disciplined, almost quiet in its execution. The old government simply had no will left to fight. By the time night deepened, the Winter Palace was surrounded. Bolshevik forces entered with little resistance. Ministers surrendered. Documents changed hands. The old government dissolved like mist in the morning light. At 2 a.m., Lenin appeared before the Soviet Congress. His clothes were wrinkled, his beard unkempt, his face exhausted, but his voice was steady. He declared, "We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order." In that moment, the old world, the world of czars, nobles, and centuries of empire, finally collapsed. The end of the Romanov era. Though the Tsar had abdicated earlier in the year, the October Revolution symbolized the true death of the Romanov world. The Winter Palace, once home to emperors, now belonged to the people. The symbols of imperial Russia, from ceremonies to uniforms, lost their power as new symbols rose. The red flag, the worker, the soldier, the Soviet. The empire that had stretched across continents, survived invasions, weathered revolts, and ruled for more than 300 years had fallen. Not with an exploding cannonball or a burning palace, but with a political decision made in the early hours of the morning. A quiet decision, a decisive one, a decision that opened a chapter of history no one could fully understand yet. A new world begins. When Lenin returned to Smolny Institute, the Bolsheviks' headquarters, supporters gathered around him. With a calm intensity, he repeated the words that would echo for decades: "We are building a new world." He did not whisper it as hope. He did not shout it as celebration. He spoke it as fact, as if the long arc of history were simply following its next logical step. To many, these words signaled liberation. To others, they signaled danger. To all, they signaled change. The world Lenin envisioned was not a small reform of the past. It was a complete reimagining of society, without kings, landlords, capitalists, or inherited privilege. A world where workers controlled factories, peasants controlled land, and councils controlled government. Whether such a world could exist, or what price would be paid to create it, no one knew. But in October 1917, the dream felt possible. The weight of the future. In the days following the revolution, Petrograd buzzed with uncertain energy. Snow began to fall, covering the streets in pale silence. Soldiers stood guard outside government buildings now marked with red banners. Workers filled meeting halls, debating policies that had once been unthinkable. Some people celebrated in the streets. Others hid in their homes, fearful of what might come. Change rarely arrives gently. Lenin, for his part, worked tirelessly. He drafted decrees on peace, land, and workers' control. He held meetings, wrote speeches, and planned the next steps. He knew that overthrowing the old world was only the beginning. Building a new one, that would be the true test. But he believed in it. Deeply. Completely. He believed that history had opened a door that had been locked for centuries, and he intended to step through it. The world watches news of the October Revolution spread across continents like a shockwave. In London, newspapers called Lenin a madman. In Paris, commentators wondered if Europe was witnessing a historical earthquake. In Berlin, generals hoped Russia's collapse would free their armies on the Eastern Front. In Asia, Africa, and Latin America, oppressed people looked to Russia with curiosity and hope. A small group of revolutionaries, barely funded, often underestimated, had toppled one of the largest empires in human history. It was astonishing. It was terrifying. It was inspiring. And it marked the beginning of a century defined by ideological conflict. The dawn of something new. As 1917 drew to a close, Lenin gazed out the window of Smolny Institute at the snow-covered streets. He saw a country battered by war, divided by class, and exhausted from suffering. But he also saw something else. Possibility. The possibility of justice. The possibility of equality. The possibility of a world rebuilt not on tradition, but on vision. He whispered the words again, not to anyone in particular, but to history itself. We are building a new world. What that world would become, no one yet knew. But the old world was gone, and the future, for better or worse, had begun. When the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, Russia did not wake up to a peaceful sunrise. It woke to uncertainty, a vast, trembling uncertainty that stretched across every corner of the former empire. The old world had fallen, but what stood in its place was not yet a world at all. It was only the beginning of an idea. Lenin believed that this idea, equality, fairness, a society built for workers and peasants, was worth every challenge that lay ahead. But revolutions are not gentle architects. They build with hope, and sometimes with force. They use idealism as mortar, and necessity as the hammer. And so, in the months that followed the revolution, Lenin and the Bolsheviks began shaping the foundations of a new Russia, one that promised justice, but demanded discipline, one that spoke of liberation, but also tightened control, one that dreamed of equality, yet walked a path paved with iron. Nationalization. Taking back the country. One of the revolution's earliest and boldest steps was nationalization, the transfer of land, factories, banks, and major industries from private hands to state control. To Lenin, nationalization was not merely an economic reform, it was a moral correction. Factories that once enriched a small elite were now declared the property of the people. Banks that once held the fortunes of nobles were placed under state authority. Railways, mines, and oil fields, the vast machinery of the Russian economy, were taken from owners and placed into what Lenin hoped would become the world's first true worker-led system. Many workers celebrated. For the first time in their lives, they felt ownership over the places where they labored. They held meetings, elected committees, and organized production. The air was filled with possibility, a sense that life was finally turning toward fairness. Yet, beneath the excitement lay a question. Who would manage this new system? Factories had workers, but they lacked engineers. Peasants had land, but little experience in large-scale agriculture. Banks had clerks, but no one knew how to run national finances in the middle of war and revolution. The dream was inspiring, but the reality was chaotic. Land reform. The peasants' victory. For centuries, Russian peasants had lived under a system where land belonged to nobles, and peasants merely worked it. Revolutions had come and gone, but the land question remained, an open wound. Lenin understood that no revolution could succeed without addressing that wound. In one sweeping decree, he ordered the redistribution of land to the peasants. Estates were broken apart, and land that had been owned by aristocrats for generations was handed to those who had spent lifetimes tilling it. Across the countryside, peasants celebrated with bonfires and festivals. Fields long held by wealthy families now belonged to those who worked them with their own hands. The countryside, for a moment, felt transformed. But the transformation was uneven. Some villages cooperated, others fought among themselves. Some peasants embraced collective farming, others clung to private plots. The dream of equality was beautiful, but reality proved far more complicated. Bread, peace, and survival urban Russia was starving. Years of war had drained grain from the countryside, and transportation lines were broken. Lenin's government faced an impossible situation: how to feed millions while the entire country struggled to keep itself upright. The Bolsheviks introduced rationing, reorganized food distribution, and sent delegates to the countryside to gather grain. It was a desperate effort to stabilize a nation on the brink of collapse. People stood in long lines for bread. Factories burned through dwindling supplies. Cities expected solutions that no government in history had ever been forced to find so quickly. The promise of bread, one of the revolution's central slogans, became both a hope and a pressure, weighing heavily on Lenin's new government. The rising opposition. Not everyone embraced the new system. Former nobles, army officers, democratic socialists, monarchists, and even some peasants opposed the Bolshevik vision. They claimed the revolution had gone too far, or not far enough. Some feared chaos, others feared tyranny. And Lenin, facing enemies on all sides, believed he had no choice but to respond with force. This was the moment when the dream of equality met the harshness of survival. Opposition newspapers were closed. Rival political parties were restricted or banned. Critics were arrested. Rebellions were crushed. Lenin argued that these actions were not cruelty, but necessity. In his view, the revolution could not survive if it tolerated those who sought to destroy it. He believed that the old world, though defeated, was still dangerous, and would strike back if given the chance. He once wrote, "We are not fighting individuals, we are fighting the old world." To many, this made sense. To others, it was the beginning of something deeply troubling. A system, both idealistic and unyielding. As the months passed, the new government took on a shape no one had fully expected. It was built on the promise of fairness, nationalized industries, land reform, worker representation. But it also wielded power with a firmness that surprised even some of Lenin's allies. On paper, the new system was one of equality. In practice, it required control. The revolution needed discipline to survive, but discipline could shade into suppression. And suppression, once begun, could grow. This duality became the defining feature of Lenin's early government. Idealism, a genuine belief in a society built for workers and peasants. Iron, a willingness to use force to protect that ideal. The dream and the discipline existed side by side, each shaping the other. A nation in transformation. Throughout 1918, Russia felt like a country being rebuilt while still in motion. Trains running while the tracks were being laid. Factories working while their rules were being rewritten. People adjusting to a system that was both freeing and demanding. Workers learned to run factories. Peasants learned to manage land. New institutions formed around Soviet councils. Schools taught new histories, new values, new ideas. There was energy, excitement, and purpose. There was also fear, confusion, and sacrifice. The old world had been rigid but familiar. The new world was flexible but uncertain. Every step forward came with a step into unknown ground. The question at the heart of the revolution. As Lenin worked day and night, crafting policies, delivering speeches, and making decisions that would define a century, a quiet question lingered beneath the surface. Can equality be built without force? Or does every revolution inevitably walk a path of iron? Lenin believed that the world he envisioned, a world without oppression, was worth the struggle. That temporary force would one day lead to permanent justice. That hardship would eventually give way to harmony, but not everyone agreed. Some feared the iron would grow stronger than the dream. Others feared the dream would fade entirely. History would spend decades debating that question. A new system is born. By the end of 1918, one thing was certain. Russia was no longer the country it had been. The czarist world of palaces and privileges was gone. The liberal hopes of the provisional government had faded. In its place stood a new system, forged from vision and necessity, a system built on the promise of equality, the power of the working class, the nationalization of wealth, the guidance of a revolutionary party, and the willingness to enforce unity in the face of opposition. To some, this system looked like the dawn of justice. To others, it looked like the birth of something rigid and unforgiving. But to Lenin, it was simply the next step in a long historical journey. A journey he had imagined years before in the quiet libraries of Europe and the frozen plains of Siberia. He saw not contradictions, but stages. Not struggles, but evolution. Not iron, but strength. He believed, above all, that Russia was learning to walk on new legs. Unsteady, imperfect, but entirely its own. The dream continues. Late one night, as snow drifted past the windows of the Kremlin, Lenin wrote in his notebook, "The world we are building is not yet visible, but it is being born." He believed this deeply, that the future would justify the present, that the dream would survive the iron, and that history, though slow, would one day reach the horizon he imagined. Whether that horizon would bring freedom or something more complex, no one yet knew. But the new world had begun, and it carried within it both hope and steel. Revolutions rarely end with the fall of a government. More often, that moment is only the first crack, the sound of a much larger, more violent storm preparing to break. For Russia, the storm began almost immediately after the October Revolution. The old order, though shaken and shattered, was not willing to disappear quietly. Forces loyal to the monarchy, to the provisional government, to regional independence movements, and to foreign powers all rose to challenge Lenin's new government. What followed was one of the most brutal and defining chapters of the 20th century, the Russian Civil War. A war not between nations, but between neighbors. Not fought on distant front lines, but in villages, railways, and frozen fields. A war that turned brother against brother, countryside against city, hope against fear. And at the center of this conflict stood two armies whose names would enter history like opposing shadows: the Red Army and the White Army. The rise of the Red Army. The Red Army, led by Leon Trotsky and backed by Lenin, was formed quickly and under immense pressure. Russia was collapsing, railways frozen, factories in disarray, famine spreading. Yet the Bolsheviks needed an army that could defend the revolution against all enemies. Trotsky reorganized the military with fierce discipline. He brought in former Tsarist officers who had experience, though he placed political commissars alongside them to ensure loyalty. Trains became mobile command centers, carrying Trotsky from battle to battle as he delivered fiery speeches to exhausted soldiers. The Red Army was not the strongest at first. It was not the best equipped. But it had something the Whites often lacked: purpose. Many Red soldiers believed they were fighting not just for survival, but for a new society. For land, for bread, for dignity, for the world Lenin promised. The White Army, a fragmented opposition. Opposing the Reds were the White forces, a loose alliance of monarchists, liberals, generals, foreign troops, and regional leaders. Their goals were scattered. Some sought to restore the Tsar, others to reestablish democracy, others to secure independence for their territories. What united them was only one thing: they wanted the Bolsheviks gone. The Whites launched offensives from all directions. In the north, British and American forces supported anti-Bolshevik troops. In Siberia, Admiral Kolchak led a massive campaign. In the south, General Denikin pushed toward Moscow. In the northwest, Yudenich threatened Petrograd. Russia became a fractured map of shifting front lines. Cities changed hands multiple times. Villages were burned, railways were destroyed, millions fled their homes. The Civil War was not a single conflict. It was dozens of conflicts woven into one, each with its own tragedies. Violence spreads across the nation. As the war intensified, violence spread like wildfire. Armies attacked each other, but they also attacked civilians. Grain was seized from villages at gunpoint. Suspected opponents were executed without trial. Entire towns suffered reprisals for supporting one side or the other. In this chaos, the dream of equality Lenin had spoken of began to blur. The revolution was in danger. The government felt surrounded. Fear began shaping decisions as much as ideology. It was during this time, in the heat of civil war, that the Bolsheviks launched one of the most controversial and defining policies of their rule: the Red Terror. The Red Terror, fear as a weapon. The Red Terror began in 1918 after an attempted assassination on Lenin. Though he survived, the attack deepened the Bolsheviks' belief that enemies were everywhere, hiding in cities, collaborating with foreign forces, waiting for a moment to strike. The Bolshevik security agency, known as the Cheka, was given extraordinary powers to arrest, interrogate, and execute without trial. Their mandate was simple: eliminate counter-revolutionaries, eliminate saboteurs, eliminate threats, real or imagined. At first, the terror was targeted. former officials, known conspirators, those actively helping the white armies. But as the Civil War worsened, the circle of enemies widened. Anyone who opposed Bolshevik control could be arrested. Anyone suspected of aiding the whites could be punished. Anyone hoarding grain, resisting requisition, or speaking critically might be labeled an enemy. Fear became a political tool, a way to enforce loyalty, silence opposition, and maintain order in a collapsing country. The revolution, once filled with hope, now marched beside shadows. A nation living between two fires. The whites also committed atrocities, mass executions, pogroms, destruction of villages. Civilians suffered terribly, no matter who occupied their region. In many places, people changed allegiance simply to survive another week. The Civil War was not a conflict of clear heroes and villains. It was a tragedy where ordinary people were trapped between two fires. The Red Army fought with ideological conviction, but it also used harsh measures to maintain control. The White Army fought with the support of foreign powers, but it failed to win the trust of peasants and workers. In the end, hunger, disease, and exhaustion killed more people than bullets. By 1920, after 2 years of relentless bloodshed, the tide began turning. The whites grew fragmented. Their leaders disagreed, countries withdrew support, and soldiers lost morale. The Reds, more unified and disciplined, pushed forward. One by one, the white offensives collapsed. Admiral Kolchak was captured and executed. General Denikin fled. Yudenich retreated. The foreign armies withdrew. The old order lost its last defenders. None power built through survival. When the Civil War finally drew to a close, the Bolsheviks had survived, but survival had come at an immense cost. Russia lay in ruins, cities destroyed, farms abandoned, railways broken, factories silent, millions dead. Victory had not brought peace. It had brought exhaustion. And the revolution that emerged from this destruction was no longer the revolution imagined in the early days. The hopeful revolution of speeches in Petrograd, of music and banners, of dreams of equality. It had become something harder, sharper, defined by necessity rather than idealism. The Bolshevik government now understood rule through force, not persuasion. They understood control, not compromise. They understood that power, once threatened, must be defended with iron. The Red Terror had reshaped the new state in ways that would last for decades. The iron logic of Revolution Lenin believed that the terror was temporary, a painful but necessary stage in the struggle. He argued that every revolution faces enemies who must be defeated if the new society is to survive. In his view, fear was not cruelty, it was strategy. Without revolutionary terror, Lenin wrote, the revolution cannot triumph. But others saw it differently. Some believed the terror distorted the very ideals the revolution claimed to defend. That fear had replaced democracy. That discipline had replaced debate. That survival had replaced justice. These questions about the cost of revolution, the use of fear, the balance between freedom and security, would haunt Russia long after the Civil War ended. The World Reacts news of the Red Terror spread across Europe and America. Critics denounced the Bolsheviks as tyrants. Supporters defended them as protectors of the oppressed. No other event in Lenin's leadership generated such fierce global debate. Was this the price of destroying an ancient empire? Was terror the only weapon strong enough to defeat counter-revolution? Or was a new form of authoritarianism quietly forming beneath the red banner? The world wondered. Russia bled. Lenin focused. A government forged in fire. By the end of the Civil War, the Bolsheviks were firmly in control. There were no monarchists left with power. No liberal factions strong enough to challenge them. no white armies capable of returning. The revolution had won, but the victory came not through idealism alone. It came through force, discipline, and the willingness to use fear. The government that emerged from this crucible was permanent in a way that earlier revolutionary movements had not been. It was centralized, organized, and overseen by a political party that had survived the darkest years of adversity. Russia now belonged to a government that understood power intimately, because it had fought desperately to preserve it. A legacy written in blood and survival. As dawn rose on the early 1920s, Lenin looked over a country scarred by war, yet ready for rebuilding. He saw the ruins, the hunger, the exhaustion. But he also saw the possibility of a new beginning. A beginning built on the victory of the Red Army. A beginning secured through the elimination of old enemies. A beginning defined by a system that mixed dreams with iron. To some, Lenin was the protector of revolution. To others, he was the architect of fear. To history, he was both. For in the Civil War and the Red Terror, Lenin's government learned the lesson that would shape the rest of its existence. Power is fragile. Power is precious. Power, once gained, must be defended, even at great cost. And so the revolution survived. But it survived in a form very different from the one imagined on the hopeful night of October 1917. The dream was still alive, but it now lived behind walls of steel. When the Russian Civil War finally quieted in the early 1920s, the silence it left behind was not peaceful. It was the silence of exhaustion. The deep, heavy quiet that follows years of hunger, destruction, and fear. Cities lay in ruins, villages were emptied, railroads twisted like broken spines across the countryside. Millions had died. Millions more wandered, displaced, searching for lost family members or abandoned homes. The Bolsheviks had won, but they had inherited a country that was barely alive. Factories stood cold and empty. Farms produced only a fraction of their former harvests. Horses had disappeared, eaten or lost in war. Machines rusted in fields. Supply chains collapsed. Russia faced famine on a scale it had not seen in centuries. In some provinces, people ate grass or boiled leather to survive. In others, entire villages starved in silence. It was a moment of truth for Lenin, perhaps the most difficult moment of his political life. He had led the revolution to victory, but victory had brought a terrible question. How do you rebuild a nation on the edge of collapse? War communism. A system pushed too far. During the Civil War, the Bolsheviks had ruled through a system known as war communism, a policy that demanded absolute control. The government seized grain from peasants, centralized all factories, banned private trade, and redirected every possible resource toward the Red Army. War communism helped the Bolsheviks win the war, but it pushed the population to the brink of rebellion. Peasants resented grain requisitioning. Workers resented strict labor rules. Families resented that food moved slowly, and bureaucracy moved quickly. By 1921, the very people who had supported the revolution were turning against it. Peasant uprisings erupted across the countryside. Workers in Petrograd went on strike. Even sailors, once considered the most loyal revolutionaries, rebelled at the Kronstadt naval base, declaring, "We wanted socialism, not this." For Lenin, the Kronstadt rebellion was especially painful. These were not counter-revolutionaries, monarchists, or foreign agents. They were the revolution's children, and they were crying out. It was clear. War communism could not continue. If it did, the revolution itself might die. A radical rethinking. In March 1921, at the 10th Party Congress, Lenin shocked his comrades. He stood before a hall of hardened revolutionaries, men and women who had fought for years, sacrificed everything, believed deeply in socialist ideals, and said words none of them expected to hear. He proposed a temporary retreat from pure socialism, a step backward to save the revolution from crumbling under its own weight. He called this new direction the New Economic Policy, or NEP. The room fell silent. For Lenin to say the revolution must step back felt unimaginable. He had always been the one pushing forward, urging bold action, dismissing moderation. But now, with Russia starving and unrest spreading, he understood that the revolution had reached a dangerous cliff. If they continued marching in the same direction, they would fall. NEP was the only bridge to survival. The return of the small trader. NEP changed the country almost overnight. For the first time since the revolution, peasants were allowed to sell their surplus grain, trade in local markets, hire seasonal labor, and run small private farms. In the cities, small businesses could reopen: bakeries, repair shops, tailors, cafes. These were not giant capitalist enterprises. They were the small, everyday trades that kept life moving. The cobbler fixing shoes, the market stall selling fruit, the workshop repairing tools. To many citizens, NEP felt like a breath of warm air after a long winter. Suddenly, markets revived. Goods reappeared in shops. Farmers grew more food because they were allowed to keep what exceeded the government tax. A new social group emerged, the netmen. Small-scale entrepreneurs who operated stalls, kiosks, and workshops. Their presence was controversial, but undeniably beneficial. They kept cities supplied with food and goods that the state could not yet produce or distribute efficiently. In a Russia that had been starving, this was not just economic recovery, it was survival. A controversial decision. Among Bolsheviks, however, NEP sparked fierce debate. Some argued that allowing private trade was a betrayal of socialism. Others warned it would revive capitalism. Some believed peasants would become too wealthy and independent. Others feared netmen would exploit workers. Lenin listened calmly, but he did not waver. He explained again and again that NEP was not abandonment, it was strategy. "We are taking one step back," he said, "to take two steps forward." He compared the revolution to a climber scaling a mountain. Sometimes, the only way to reach the summit is to descend slightly, find firmer ground, and then proceed upward with greater strength. For Lenin, NEP was that descent, a temporary retreat that would allow the country to gather the strength it needed for future progress. The people's response, the reaction across Russia, was immediate. Peasants who had resisted grain requisitions now brought food willingly to markets. Workers, though still struggling, saw more goods available in cities. Families found hope again as famine slowly loosened its grip. Russia's recovery was not instant, but it was unmistakable. Fields began producing again, markets grew lively, trade routes reopened, money circulated, even factories that had rusted during the war resumed production. After years of destruction, something new was blooming. Stability. Lenin's pragmatism. Even Lenin's harshest critics acknowledged that he had shown something unexpected. Pragmatism. He had not clung rigidly to ideology at the cost of people's lives. He had not demanded purity when purity meant starvation. Instead, he allowed the revolution to breathe, to adapt, to survive. He told his comrades, "We must learn to build socialism with the tools we have, not the tools we wish we had." Lenin knew that Russia was not an industrial powerhouse like Germany or Britain. It was a largely agrarian nation, recovering from war, lacking equipment, skilled labor, and functioning infrastructure. To impose strict socialism immediately would destroy it. NEP, then, was a recognition of reality, a bridge between a ruined past and a distant ideal. But not without tension. Yet beneath this recovery, tension simmered. Some peasants grew wealthy, creating inequality within villages. Nepimen became targets of resentment for their profits. Hardline Bolsheviks complained that capitalism had returned through the back door. Even ordinary citizens found the system confusing. They had been told that the revolution would abolish private trade, yet now private stalls filled the markets. Russia felt like a country caught between two worlds. Not capitalist, not fully socialist, but something in between. It was a strange, transitional space, a place where survival mattered more than ideology. A country saving itself. Over the next few years, NEP slowly transformed Russia from the inside. Food production doubled. Industrial output began to climb. Cities revived. Villages stabilized. Famine receded. School children grew stronger. Families rebuilt homes. Soldiers returned to farms. For the first time since the revolution, people could imagine a future. And yet, even as the country healed, Lenin knew NEP could not last forever. It was a temporary solution, a pause in the march towards socialism. The contradictions within the system, inequality, private profit, market relationships, could one day spark new conflicts. But for now, Russia was alive. For now, the revolution had survived. A difficult but necessary choice. Years later, historians would look back at NEP with mixed interpretations. Was it a betrayal? A clever strategy? A sign of weakness? A moment of visionary leadership? But one fact is undeniable. Without NEP, Russia might not have survived the 1920s at all. It was the rope that kept the country from slipping off the cliff, the breath of air that allowed it to recover, the compromise that made future possibilities, good or bad, even conceivable. Lenin understood this deeply. He did not fear practical adjustments. He feared losing the revolution entirely. In this, NEP was not an act of surrender. It was an act of preservation. A lasting legacy. As Lenin's health began to decline, he watched NEP take root with a mixture of hope and worry. He saw that it worked, that it saved millions, revived towns, and stabilized the nation. But he also knew that NEP opened the door to debates about the revolution's future. Would Russia continue with gradual economic freedom? Would it return to strict socialism? Would someone else reinterpret Lenin's policies in unexpected ways? Time would answer these questions, not Lenin. But for this moment, this fragile, vital moment, Russia was healing. A country devastated by war had found a way to stand again. A revolution hardened by conflict had learned flexibility. A leader known for iron decisions had shown the power of stepping back. And so, NEP became one of the most surprising chapters of Lenin's life. A chapter in which the revolutionary known for bold, uncompromising action made a choice, guided not by ideology, but by humanity. A choice that shocked many. A choice that saved millions. A choice that preserved a nation. By the early 1920s, Lenin was only in his early 50s, still young by many standards, still sharp, still driven by the same fire that had carried him through exile, revolution, and civil war. Yet, the years had taken their toll. The weight of leadership, the strain of constant crisis, and the pressure of rebuilding a shattered nation pressed on him every day. He worked long hours, often late into the night, reviewing reports, dictating letters, reading theoretical papers, and shaping policies that would determine the future of the Soviet state. His energy astonished his colleagues, but it came at a cost. In May 1922, while meeting with comrades, Lenin suddenly felt a severe pain and lost the ability to speak. His right side weakened. He struggled to form words. The great orator, the tireless debater, the unyielding revolutionary, now grasping for sounds that would not come. Lenin had suffered a stroke. The man who had reshaped the largest empire in the world now faced an enemy he could not outthink, outmaneuver, or overpower: time itself. Immediate forced into silence. The news of Lenin's stroke shocked the Soviet leadership. His presence had always been a constant, the guiding star of the revolution. Without him, the Bolshevik state felt suddenly unmoored. Doctors ordered him to rest, to avoid stress, to stop working. But Lenin could no more abandon his work than a river could stop flowing because a stone blocked its path. He tried to return to his duties, dictating letters even as his hand trembled. He attended meetings with his head wrapped in bandages to ease the pain. But the strokes continued. One came in December 1922, another in March 1923. Each one stole a little more of his strength. Each one dimmed his voice. Each one reminded him that his time was running out. But even as his body failed, Lenin's mind raced ahead, toward the future he feared he might never see. A growing concern within the party. From his sickbed, Lenin observed something troubling. The Soviet government was no longer a fragile newborn struggling to survive. It was becoming an institution, powerful, organized, hierarchical. And within that hierarchy, certain individuals were gaining immense influence. One figure in particular caught Lenin's attention: Joseph Stalin. Stalin had been appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1922, a position that seemed administrative, but in reality gave him control over party appointments, documents, and internal communication. Slowly, quietly, he was building networks of loyalty. Lenin, weakened but still perceptive, watched this development with growing alarm. Stalin was efficient, disciplined, and utterly loyal to the party, but he was also harsh, inflexible, and willing to use intimidation to achieve his goals. Lenin feared what such a man might become if left unchecked. The Testament. Lenin's last warning. As his health deteriorated, Lenin made one final attempt to shape the future. From his study in Gorky, surrounded by books and medical equipment, he dictated a series of notes, reflections on the party leadership, the structure of the Soviet government, and the dangers he saw ahead. These notes would later be known as Lenin's Testament. In them, he evaluated key leaders, but his sharpest criticism was reserved for Stalin. He wrote, "Comrade Stalin has concentrated enormous power in his hands, and I am not sure he will use that power with sufficient caution." Lenin warned that Stalin's temperament, his rudeness, his impatience, his tendency to bully others, could become dangerous. He recommended that Stalin be removed from his position as General Secretary. It was an extraordinary act, a dying revolutionary, looking beyond his own life, trying to protect the future he had sacrificed everything to build. But fate, as it often does, intervened. A voice no longer. Heard Lenin suffered another major stroke in March 1923 that left him unable to speak. He could no longer write notes, dictate letters, or address meetings. His thoughts remained clear, but the bridge between his mind and the outside world had collapsed. He became a silent observer, trapped in a body that no longer obeyed him, watching events unfold like a passenger unable to steer the ship he had once commanded. In this silence, one of the most consequential decisions in Soviet history was made, quietly, behind closed doors. His testament was suppressed. The leaders of the party, including Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Stalin himself, agreed it should not be made public. They feared the destabilizing effect it would have on the leadership and on the party's unity. Some believed that Lenin had exaggerated. Others saw an opportunity to advance their own political futures. And so, the warning went unheard. The future Lenin feared in his final months was allowed to take root. A man who saw the future. Too late. From his window at Gorky, Lenin watched visitors come and go, saw documents brought to him that he could no longer sign, and listened to whispered reports he could no longer answer. The revolution was moving forward, but without him. He must have wondered, had he built something strong enough to survive? Had he entrusted power to the right people? Had the revolution taken a path he no longer recognized? These questions haunted him in his final year. He had dreamed of a world of workers' councils, collective equality, and democratic participation. But now he saw bureaucracy rising where idealism once lived. He saw power concentrating in the hands of a few. He saw the seeds of something hard and authoritarian, something far from the world he had imagined in the early days of revolution. A man who had once changed history now sat powerless before it. His final days. In late 1923, Lenin's condition worsened dramatically. He could no longer walk without assistance. His right arm was paralyzed. Words slipped away from him like birds escaping a cage. Visitors came less often, afraid to disturb him, unsure of what to say. Even Stalin visited, though their relationship had grown cold. Lenin watched all of this with the quiet awareness of a man who understood that time was no longer his ally. He died on January 21st, 1924, at the age of 53. His body was carried through the snowy streets of Moscow, watched by hundreds of thousands of grieving citizens. The city that had once been Petrograd's rival now became the capital of the world's first socialist state, a nation built on Lenin's ideas, led by men he had come to distrust. The legacy of a man against time. After Lenin's death, the Soviet Union entered a new era, one shaped not by Lenin's warnings, but by the ambitions of those who survived him. Stalin would rise to become one of the most powerful and feared leaders of the 20th century. The bureaucracy Lenin dreaded would grow into a towering structure. The ideals of October would evolve, distort, and sometimes vanish beneath layers of fear. Historians would debate for decades whether Lenin predicted this outcome. But one thing is clear. In his final months, he saw a future forming, and he could no longer change it. He had built a revolution with brilliance and courage, but revolutions have lives of their own. Once released into the world, they grow in directions even their creators cannot control. Lenin's last struggle was not against political enemies or rival ideologies. It was against time, the relentless force that takes from even the greatest minds their chance to finish the work they began. He left behind a country reshaped, a world transformed, and a legacy both inspiring and troubling. A visionary who could see the future, a leader who could bend history, a man who, in the end, had to watch history move without him. When Vladimir Lenin died in 1924, Russia entered a strange and fragile moment, a moment suspended between memory and future, between grief and ambition. The man who had led a revolution, defeated an empire, navigated civil war, and reconstructed a devastated country was now gone. But his presence did not vanish with him. Instead, it multiplied. Across Russia, and soon across the world, Lenin became not simply a political leader, but a symbol of revolution, a symbol of workers' power, a symbol of a new world struggling to be born. And like all powerful symbols, Lenin's image began to shift, taking shapes that he himself might barely recognize. A legacy rewritten. In the days immediately following his death, the Soviet leadership gathered to discuss how to honor Lenin. Many expected a simple burial, perhaps a quiet ceremony befitting a man who, despite his worldwide impact, had lived a relatively modest life. But others proposed something different, something unprecedented. They suggested that Lenin's body be preserved, placed on display, and turned into a kind of eternal monument. The idea was controversial, deeply at odds with Lenin's own wishes, But the argument was clear. Lenin's presence must continue, even if his life had ended. Within months, architects and scientists constructed a mausoleum on Red Square. Crowds lined up for hours in the cold, filing past the glass sarcophagus, whispering prayers, poems, or silent promises. To them, Lenin was no longer just a person. He was history itself, still quiet, eternal. But while this physical monument stood unchanged, Lenin's intellectual legacy was being rewritten in ways far more complex. The battle over. Lenin's memory. Lenin left behind writings that stretched across decades. Articles, speeches, philosophical essays, letters, personal reflections. They were filled with nuance, contradictions, and evolving ideas. They revealed moments of flexibility, as well as moments of uncompromising firmness. They showed a man who adapted to changing circumstances, who questioned himself, who revised strategies repeatedly. But after his death, Soviet leaders began selecting from that legacy, highlighting certain ideas, obscuring others, reshaping the man to fit the needs of the state. Some portrayed Lenin as a flawless, heroic figure whose every decision pointed the way toward the future. Others emphasized his strictness, his discipline, his demands for unity. Still others drew attention to his vision of equality, portraying him as a gentle defender of the working class. 1,000 books were written, 1,000 interpretations debated, 1,000 Lenins emerged. And in every version, something was lost. And something was added. The more the world spoke his name, the more difficult it became to find the real man beneath the myth. Statues rising across the planet. By the 1930s and 1940s, as the Soviet Union grew in strength and influence, Lenin's image traveled far beyond the borders of Russia. Statues of Lenin rose in Eastern Europe, China, Vietnam, Cuba, Africa, the Middle East, and countless small nations shaped by anti-colonial struggles. Some statues were simple, a man holding a cap, looking into the distance. Others were grand, Lenin pointing forward, leading the masses toward a radiant horizon. Entire cities renamed their streets, their schools, their squares after him. His face appeared on posters, murals, postage stamps, medals, textbooks, and banners. Children were taught songs about him. Families kept portraits of him. Workers marched under his name. To millions around the world, Lenin symbolized hope, a promise that the poor could rise, that history could be rewritten, that ordinary people could shape their own destiny. But to millions of others, Lenin symbolized fear, the memory of the Red Terror, the rise of authoritarianism, and the harshness of a system that could suppress dissent with unforgiving precision. Lenin's statues cast long shadows, some comforting, some troubling, depending on where one stood. Controversy grows alongside reverence. As time passed, the debate over Lenin's legacy became as large as his influence. Scholars argued about his intentions, his methods, and the consequences of his choices. Nations adopted or rejected Leninism, not only for ideological reasons, but for practical, political, and historical ones. Was Lenin a defender of the oppressed? Was he a visionary? Was he a tyrant? A strategist? A liberator? A destroyer? Different eras produced different answers. In some countries, Lenin's ideas inspired social programs, literacy campaigns, and land reforms. In others, those same ideas became associated with political repression, economic hardship, or violent revolution. The world that followed Lenin was not uniform. It was fractured, contested, contradictory. And Lenin, now a symbol rather than a man, lived differently within each of those contradictions. Leninism, the spine of a superpower, while Lenin himself never used the term. Leninism. It soon became one of the central doctrines of the 20th century. Leninism unified, The concept of a vanguard party. The strategy of revolution. The role of the state in economic planning. The framework of Marxist theory adapted for real-world application. And the idea that socialism required a disciplined political structure. Under Stalin, Leninism evolved further, sometimes aligned with Lenin's writings, sometimes in direct contradiction to them. Yet, the official narrative remained. Lenin showed the way. We are carrying out his vision. Leninism became the ideological spine of the Soviet Union, a superpower that rose from the ruins of civil war to challenge the might of the United States and reshape global politics for decades. From the space race to industrialization, from foreign policy to education, Lenin's name was used to justify decisions both noble and destructive. Even when policies drifted far from Lenin's actual words, leaders invoked his guidance as if his voice echoed across time, directing them from a mausoleum of polished stone. A world split in two. By the mid-20th century, Lenin's legacy had become one of the dividing lines of the world. The Cold War turned ideological debates into geopolitical conflicts. Nations aligned themselves as either supporters of Leninist socialism or defenders of liberal capitalism. Millions joined one side or the other, believing the fate of humanity depended on their choice. Lenin's name appeared in speeches at the United Nations, in rural villages in Vietnam, in guerrilla camps in Latin America, in universities across Europe, and in protest movements in Africa and the Middle East. Some of these movements brought liberation. Some brought suffering. All were shaped in some way by a man who had died decades earlier. A legacy that refuses to end. As the 20th century drew toward its close, the Soviet Union collapsed, the world's most powerful Leninist experiment ending not in triumph, but in economic strain, political tension, and public disillusionment. Statues of Lenin were torn down in some countries, preserved in others, and quietly forgotten in many. But even as monuments fell and governments changed, Lenin's impact did not vanish. It lingered in debates about inequality, power, and justice. It lived in countries still shaped by Leninist or Marxist parties. It appeared in academic arguments, political speeches, and social movements. Whether admired or condemned, Lenin's name continued to echo. The man behind the myth. In the end, understanding Lenin requires more than choosing a side. It requires acknowledging the scale of his influence. A thinker whose ideas transformed more than half the world. A leader whose decisions saved and harmed millions. A man whose vision shaped nations long after he left the earth. And it requires seeing the tension that defined his legacy. He fought for equality, yet built a system that centralized power. He sought liberation, yet used force to protect the revolution. He dreamed of a better world, yet left behind a world divided. His legacy became not one legacy, but many. The world that followed. Decades after Lenin's death, the world still stands in the shadow of his ideas. Even nations that reject Leninism continue to debate his theories and confront the consequences of systems built in opposition to him. The superpower he helped create influenced global politics, culture, science, and war. And somewhere in this complex, contradictory global landscape, Lenin remains what he became in death. A symbol, a question, a mirror reflecting hopes and fears, justice and power, dreams and consequences. A man whose ideas outlived him. A thinker who could no longer shape the future, but whose future still shaped the world. Lenin died a century ago, yet the world he helped create, and the ideas he carried, still move through politics, economics, and public debate like an underground river. Silent at times, roaring at others, always shaping the landscape in ways we often do not realize. Some historical figures fade into museums. Lenin did not. he became a question the world has not stopped asking. How should societies be organized? What is justice? What role should the state play in protecting the vulnerable? And at what point does protection become oppression? These questions, sharpened by Lenin's writings, decisions, and contradictions, continue to divide scholars, governments, activists, and ordinary people around the globe. The unfinished debate about Class 1 of Lenin's central beliefs was rooted in Marxist theory. That class struggle is the engine of history. He argued that societies evolve not through gentle reform, but through conflict between groups with different economic interests, workers and owners, peasants and landlords, rich and poor. To him, class was not merely a social category, it was a battlefield. This idea still resonates. Across continents, movements for economic justice echo Lenin's insistence that inequality is not accidental, but structural. When workers protest low wages in Asia, when farmers demand fair land rights in Latin America, when students fight rising costs in Europe, the language they use, exploitation, oppression, solidarity, often reflects Lenin's influence, even if indirectly. To many, Lenin helped give the poor a voice, a vocabulary, and a moral argument. But to others, Lenin's emphasis on class conflict legitimized violence, fueled division, and justified harsh measures that replaced one form of power with another. The debate persists because inequality persists. And where inequality exists, so too does the question Lenin asked: who benefits from the way society is built? The role of the state: protector or prison? Another pillar of Lenin's thought concerned the state, its power, its responsibilities, and its dangers. Lenin believed the state should act decisively on behalf of workers and peasants, protecting them from exploitation and using its authority to reorganize society. He argued that without a strong state, revolutions collapse into chaos or are crushed by counter-revolution. To those who admire him, Lenin's model shows how a government can lift the poor from misery, guarantee basic rights, expand education and healthcare, and redistribute wealth more fairly. Indeed, many social programs around the world, even outside socialist nations, were inspired by or developed in reaction to Leninist ideas about economic equality and state responsibility. But critics see another side to this legacy. They argue that Lenin's belief in a strong state, combined with one-party rule, opened the door to authoritarianism. They claim that by suppressing opposition early, by enforcing unity through fear, Lenin planted seeds that later grew into systems where dissent was crushed, creativity stifled, and individual freedom curtailed. Supporters say the state can be a shield. Opponents say the state becomes a cage. And both arguments trace their roots to the world Lenin imagined. The dream of equality. Even Lenin's strongest critics acknowledge that his central dream, a world without exploitation, remains morally compelling. He envisioned a society where workers controlled their workplaces, peasants owned land, wealth did not determine destiny, and children grew up with equal opportunity. In the early days of the revolution, this dream inspired millions. It helped overthrow a centuries-old empire. It gave hope to people who had lived in poverty for generations. It spread to distant continents where oppressed populations looked to Russia as proof that change was possible. To this day, many see Lenin as a liberator, a man who broke the power of aristocrats, destroyed feudal hierarchies, and proclaimed that ordinary people deserve dignity. For them, Lenin's legacy is one of courage and compassion. They say he gave the poor a future, the fear of autocracy. But others remember a different legacy. They point to the Red Terror, suppression of rival parties, censorship, political prisons, and the foundation of a system where one party held absolute control. To them, Lenin did not liberate Russia. He replaced one form of absolute power with another. They argue that by concentrating authority in the hands of a small political elite, Lenin created a structure that later leaders could, and did, turn into full dictatorship. For these critics, Lenin's legacy is a warning about the dangers of unchecked power. They say he opened the path to authoritarianism. A legacy of light and shadow? What makes Lenin's legacy so enduring and so divisive is that both sides contain truth. He fought for equality, but used force to achieve it. He empowered the poor, but silenced political rivals. He envisioned freedom, but believed discipline was necessary to reach it. He condemned oppression, but tolerated oppression when he believed the revolution was threatened. This duality, light and shadow intertwined, ensures that Lenin remains one of the most debated figures in modern history. A global influence that refuses to fade. More than 50 countries at one time adopted systems influenced by Leninist ideas. Some became major powers. Others descended into conflict. Some used Lenin's writings to launch literacy campaigns and combat famine. Others adopted only the harsher aspects of his strategy. Even in nations with no connection to communism, Lenin's legacy shaped debates about land reform, workers' rights, the minimum wage, public health care, unions, inequality, and the responsibility of governments toward their citizens. Every time a politician argues the state should provide basic services, every time activists demand structural change, every time societies question the fairness of economic systems, Lenin's ideas quietly echo in the background. He shaped not only the countries that embraced his ideology, but also those that defined themselves in opposition to it. Why Lenin still divides us? Lenin forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Is violence justified in the pursuit of justice? Can equality be achieved without force? How much power should governments have? Should the poor be empowered through policy or revolution? And what happens when ideals meet reality? These questions remain unresolved. They are the very questions shaping politics today. Some look at the world with its billionaires, struggling workers, wealth gaps, and unequal opportunities, and say Lenin was right. Society must change fundamentally. Others look at political repression under Lenin's successors and say he was wrong. Too much power in too few hands is always dangerous. Because of this, Lenin is not merely a historical figure. He is a lens through which people interpret justice, a mirror reflecting their hopes and fears, a symbol of what they want the world to be, or what they fear it might become. A legacy that lives in debate. In classrooms, scholars teach Lenin as both visionary and cautionary tale. In political movements, activists invoke his ideas with passion or reject them with equal intensity. In former Soviet states, statues have been toppled in protest or carefully preserved as reminders of a different era. Lenin lives in arguments, in speeches, in books, and in memories. He does not rest silently in a mausoleum. He walks through the world in the language we use to talk about power, justice, oppression, equality, and revolution. Ideas that outlived their maker, Lenin once wrote. Ideas become powerful when they take root in the minds of the masses. His ideas did exactly that. Long after his death, long after the fall of the Soviet Union, long after his writings faded from official doctrine in many lands, the essence of Lenin's thinking continues to move societies, sometimes toward justice, sometimes toward struggle, always toward change. For better or worse, Lenin's legacy is not a closed chapter. It is an open debate. A debate about who we are, what kind of world we want, and what price we are willing to pay to build it. And as long as humanity continues to wrestle with inequality, power, and freedom, Lenin's ideas, dividing, inspiring, warning, will remain alive. History is full of battles fought with weapons, but it is also full of battles fought with ideas. Ideas about fairness, equality, power, and the meaning of justice. Sometimes these battles are quiet debates in classrooms. Sometimes they are loud debates in the streets. And sometimes, as in the case of Lenin and the world he helped transform, these battles become revolutions that shake entire nations. But beneath all the events, the marches, the speeches, the uprisings, the policies, lies a question as old as civilization itself. What is justice? It is a question philosophers have asked for thousands of years. Plato asked it. Aristotle asked it. Confucius asked it. And whether he intended to or not, Lenin forced the modern world to ask it again. Tonight, we look not at Lenin the revolutionary or Lenin the political figure, but Lenin as a lens, a way to understand how complex the pursuit of justice can be. The eternal question: what does justice look like? Imagine a world where everyone is treated fairly, where each person has enough food, a safe home, access to education, and the chance to live with dignity, where no one is born into suffering simply because of their family, class, or economic status. This, at its core, was the dream behind Lenin's revolution. It was a dream shared by millions of ordinary people across Russia, peasants who had lived in poverty for generations, workers who endured dangerous factories, soldiers who fought wars they did not choose. To them, justice meant a chance at a better life. And yet, history teaches us something difficult. Justice is not a single destination. It is a path, and different people walk it in different ways. For some, justice means creating equal opportunities. For others, it means protecting individual freedoms. For Lenin, justice meant dismantling oppressive systems, even if doing so required enormous force. And this is where the philosophical puzzle deepens. When a beautiful ideal meets harsh reality, the idea of ending exploitation is undeniably beautiful. Few would argue against a world with less suffering and more fairness. But ideals, when carried into the real world, meet obstacles: human weakness, fear, greed, ambition, misunderstanding, and the unpredictable nature of society itself. Lenin believed that justice required not gentle persuasion, but a forceful reorganization of society. He believed that those who benefited from inequality would never give up their power willingly. Therefore, justice demanded struggle, even violence. This leads us to a difficult question. Can justice still be justice if it is imposed by force? This is not only Lenin's question. It is one of the oldest debates in ethical philosophy. Plato believed that just society required wise guardians who enforced harmony. Aristotle believed justice was about balance, not equality. Immanuel Kant argued that moral actions must respect individual freedom. Meanwhile, Marx believed justice required removing the economic chains that limited human potential. Lenin stepped into this debate with his own conclusion. If oppression is violent, then liberation may require violence too. To him, force was not the opposite of justice. It was the price of justice. But to many others, force is where justice begins to break. When do ideals become dangerous? History shows that ideals are powerful. They inspire people to march, to speak, to dream, to sacrifice. But ideals can become dangerous when leaders believe they alone possess the truth. Because when someone believes that their vision of justice justifies any action, even harmful ones, the line between justice and injustice becomes blurry. Lenin believed deeply in equality, but in enforcing his vision, his government became willing to use fear, violence, and control. This tension between idealism and coercion raises a timeless ethical question. Does a good goal excuse a harmful method? If the goal is dignity, can suppression be justified? If the goal is fairness, can freedom be limited? If the goal is peace, can violence be acceptable? Different people, different cultures, and different eras give different answers, but none escape the complexity. The story of Lenin reminds us that justice is not just about what we want to achieve, but how we choose to achieve it. The lesson for a new generation. Young people today live in a world shaped, directly or indirectly, by the choices made in Lenin's time. Nations rose and fell because of his ideas. Economies transformed. Wars were fought. Movements for liberation used his writings as guidebooks. Movements for democracy used them as warnings. And now, a new generation stands before a new century, facing its own challenges. Economic inequality, environmental crisis, political division, global migration, technology reshaping jobs, widening gaps between rich and poor everywhere. People are asking again, what is justice? What does a fair society look like? What must we do to build it? Young people are forming their own visions through activism, voting, art, and community work. They see injustice clearly: rising costs of living, limited access to opportunity, discrimination, conflict. And like generations before them, they feel the urge to fix what is broken. Lenin's story is not a model to copy, but a conversation to join. It teaches that big dreams can change the world, but also that big dreams can cause harm if pursued without reflection, humility, or caution. It challenges young people to ask, how do we balance justice with compassion? How do we pursue fairness without creating new forms of oppression? How do we fight for change without losing sight of humanity? The dual nature of revolutionary justice. Justice has two faces. The first is hopeful. It fights for the oppressed, protects the vulnerable, and demands fairness. The second is powerful. It can become rigid, unyielding, even unforgiving in its pursuit of ideals. Lenin embodied both faces. He fought for a world where peasants and workers could live with dignity. He also built a system that relied on central control and political discipline. This duality is not unique to Lenin. It appears whenever societies attempt large changes, when movements seek to correct historical wrongs, when governments try to build equality, when activists demand reform. Justice, when pursued without wisdom, can become injustice. Justice, when pursued with courage and care, can become transformation. The challenge lies in telling the two apart. Justice as a journey, not a destination. One of the most important lessons from Lenin's story is that justice is not something we arrive at. It is something we continually try to create. No society achieves perfect equality. No government achieves perfect fairness. No revolution achieves perfect freedom. But every generation can move closer. Justice, in its truest form, is not about imposing one vision on everyone. It is about listening, understanding, improving, and finding ways to uplift those who have been ignored or mistreated. It is about asking difficult questions and being brave enough to face the answers. And it is about remembering that justice must always be paired with humanity, or it risks becoming its opposite. A question carried forward. As we close this chapter of Lenin's story, we return to the question that shaped so much of his life. What is justice? Is it equality? Is it opportunity? Is it freedom? Is it dignity? Is it the absence of suffering? Is it the presence of compassion? Perhaps it is all of these. Perhaps it changes with time, culture, and circumstance. Perhaps justice is not a simple definition, but a promise we try to honor. For the young people listening today, the question is now yours to answer. What will justice mean for your generation? What kind of world will you choose to build? And what methods will you choose to get there? Because the story of Lenin is not only a historical account, it is a reminder, powerful and cautionary, that ideas can reshape nations, but the way we pursue those ideas shapes the soul of those nations. Justice is a light, but how we carry that light determines whether it guides or burns. History sometimes changes through grand battles or dramatic speeches, but sometimes it changes through a set of ideas. Ideas born in quiet rooms, carried through exile, spoken in meetings, written in pamphlets, whispered in secret circles, until one day they reshape the map of the world. Lenin did not live to witness it, but the world that followed his death was shaped profoundly by the vision he left behind. That vision of class struggle, state-led transformation, and the possibility of a worker-led society did more than change Russia. It split the planet in two. For more than 4 decades, humanity lived in the shadow of a global standoff, a Cold War where two worlds faced one another across borders, oceans, and ideologies. And at the root of this division lay the legacy of one man. The birth of two worlds. After Lenin's death in 1924, the Soviet Union slowly emerged from civil war, famine, and reconstruction. But even as the country healed internally, it grew externally, becoming not merely a nation, but the center of a new ideological world. Lenin's ideas, reshaped and interpreted by those who followed him, became the foundation of a superpower. Factories rose from ruins, new cities appeared. The state expanded education, electrification, and heavy industry. A nation once defined by peasants and empires now defined itself through steel, technology, and global ambition. Meanwhile, across Europe and America, governments watched with a mixture of curiosity, fear, admiration, and suspicion. Some wondered, could this Soviet experiment succeed? Would it bring prosperity to the working class? Others worried. Was this a threat to freedom? Would revolution spread beyond Russia? The world was no longer merely divided by geography. It was divided by vision. The rise of the Soviet superpower. Under Stalin and subsequent leaders, the Soviet Union became a force the world could not ignore. Its army helped defeat Nazi Germany. Its scientists launched the first satellite, Sputnik, into space. Its influence stretched across Europe and deep into Asia. And through all this, the Soviet Union held firmly to an identity rooted in Lenin's writings and revolution. A one-party state, a centrally planned economy, the belief that capitalism and socialism were destined to clash, and the confidence that history had an inevitable direction. To Soviet leaders, Lenin was not simply a founder. He was a prophet whose ideas justified every sacrifice and every victory. His portrait hung in every office, every school, every military base. His quotes filled textbooks. His mausoleum became a site of national pilgrimage. And through this narrative, the USSR defined itself as the guardian of a global struggle between two rival visions of humanity. The Western response. In the West, led largely by the United States, a different vision took shape. Capitalism, democracy, private ownership, and individual liberties formed the pillars of an alternative worldview. The rise of the Soviet Union and the revolutionary movements it inspired convinced many Western leaders that Lenin's ideas represented not merely competition, but an existential threat. Thus, as the 20th century progressed, two vast ideological systems faced one another. Socialism shaped by Leninism versus capitalist liberal democracy. Each believed it represented justice. each believed the other was dangerous. Each sought to influence the world. This ideological rivalry would define global politics from the late 1940s until the early 1990s. The Cold War begins. The Cold War did not erupt like a conventional conflict. There were no opening battles or sudden declarations. Instead, it emerged gradually, like frost creeping across a window. The division of Europe after World War II, the Berlin blockade, the formation of NATO, the rise of communist governments in Eastern Europe and China, all these events built tension. Soon, the world found itself organized into two major blocs. The Eastern Bloc, aligned with the Soviet Union and shaped by Leninist political structures. The Western Bloc, aligned with the United States, promoting capitalist democracy. Between them lay the developing world, nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America seeking independence, caught between these two competing visions. And, across this global landscape, Lenin's ideas became both inspiration and battleground. Revolutions inspired by Lenin believed that oppressed nations and classes around the world could rise up, much as Russia had done. After his death, many movements adopted this belief. Revolutions erupted in China, Vietnam, Cuba, Angola, Ethiopia, Nicaragua. Some movements drew directly from Leninist thought: the need for a vanguard party, the necessity of centralized leadership, the role of peasants or workers in overthrowing oppressive regimes. In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh carried Lenin's writings in his backpack during the struggle for independence. In Cuba, Fidel Castro blended nationalism with Marxist-Leninist principles. In Africa, revolutionary leaders saw Lenin's ideas as tools for resisting colonialism. For these movements, Lenin represented liberation, the possibility of rewriting history with courage and vision. But the outcomes varied. Some revolutions brought progress. Others led to suffering. Many produced a mix of both. Lenin's legacy was not a single road, but a branching forest of paths that nations walked differently. The arms race and the shadow of fear. As the Cold War deepened, the rivalry between the two superpowers took on a terrifying dimension: nuclear weapons. The United States and the Soviet Union built arsenals capable of destroying the planet many times over. Missiles were pointed across oceans. Bombers waited on airstrips. Submarines prowled beneath the waves. The world, for the first time in history, lived under the permanent possibility of annihilation. And all of this tension, this global paranoia and precarious balance, trace back to two opposing visions of how societies should be organized. In the minds of millions, Lenin's ideas had become linked not only with revolution, but with the most dangerous standoff humanity had ever known. Two worlds, one planet. For nearly half a century, children in school classrooms learned different versions of history depending on which side of the Cold War they were born on. In the East, Lenin was the great liberator, the founder of a just society, the visionary whose ideas would guide humanity toward equality. In the West, Lenin was the architect of tyranny, the seed of totalitarianism, the man whose vision threatened democracy itself. This dual reality shaped literature, films, propaganda, diplomacy, and education. Families grew up hearing stories from only one side. Nations built entire identities around what Lenin symbolized to them. The world was, quite literally, split in two. The fall of the Soviet Union by the late 1980s, the Soviet system, born from Lenin's revolution but transformed by decades of economic strain and political rigidity, began to falter. Reforms tried to save it, but the collapse became unavoidable. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. The map of the world changed again. Statues were taken down. Flags were lowered. New nations emerged from the fragments of an empire. And yet, even after the USSR disappeared, the ideological divide did not fully vanish. Debates over capitalism, socialism, state control, and class inequality remained central to global politics. The world was no longer split into two superpowers, but the division of ideas, shaped in part by Lenin's vision, still lived on. How one man changed history. Today, when scholars look at Lenin, they see more than a revolutionary. They see a turning point for humanity. His ideas, whether admired or rejected, forced nations to confront deep questions about economic justice, political power, social equality, the responsibilities of the state, the rights of individuals. He did not merely change Russia, he changed how the world debates fairness and governance. He reshaped borders, inspired movements, ignited conflicts, and influenced how billions of people understood their place in society. Few individuals have ever altered global history so profoundly. The Cold War's echo today. Even though the Cold War officially ended, its echoes remain. Nations still argue about state control versus free markets. Political movements still reference Lenin's ideas, either in support or opposition. Global tensions between major powers continue, shaped by different visions of justice and governance. Inequality and class struggle remain unresolved issues, fueling debates that Lenin once articulated a century ago. The world is no longer divided into two monolithic blocks, but it is still divided by the questions Lenin helped bring to the surface. A planet still wrestling with vision. In the end, Lenin's influence did not simply shape the Soviet Union or the Cold War. It shaped how humanity thinks about the future. It shaped our understanding of revolution, of justice, of oppression, of freedom, of power, and of the extraordinary impact one person's ideas can have when they ignite the hearts of millions. The world that followed Lenin was not the world he imagined. It was bigger, more conflicted, more hopeful, more dangerous. A world split in two, held together by tension, divided by ideology, forever shaped by the vision of a single human being. History often remembers people as symbols: heroes, villains, revolutionaries, tyrants. But behind every symbol is a human being, shaped by hopes, fears, limitations, and dreams. To understand Lenin fully, we must look beyond the statues, the speeches, the slogans, and even the revolutions. We must look at the person who lived beneath all of it. A young boy reading late into the night. A student expelled from university for refusing silence. A brother grieving a loved one executed by the Tsar's regime. A man exiled in snowy Siberia, writing furiously in notebooks. A thinker filled with determination, frustration, conviction, and doubt. A leader who believed he could reshape history, and somehow did. This is the human story of Lenin. Not the myth, not the propaganda, not the criticism alone, but the human journey of a man wrestling with one of the most difficult questions humanity has ever faced. How do we use power to build a better world? A life defined by vision. Throughout Lenin's life, one theme remained constant: vision. He believed deeply that society could be rebuilt, not gradually, not politely, but fundamentally. To him, injustice was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. Therefore, justice required tearing that system down and creating something entirely new. This belief drove every stage of his life. It pushed him into political activism as a teenager. It guided him through exile and imprisonment. It fueled his writing and debates. It strengthened him during the desperate years of civil war. It shaped the policies he created. It influenced how millions of people viewed themselves and their futures. Vision, for Lenin, was not optional. It was oxygen. But vision alone is not enough. Every vision needs power to make it real. And this is where Lenin's story becomes more complex, more human, more tragic, and more universal. The double-edged nature of power is one of humanity's oldest questions. We see it in ancient myths, where gods fight for dominance. We see it in Shakespeare, where kings rise and fall. We see it in modern politics, where nations struggle to shape global events. Lenin understood the need for power. Without power, he believed, there could be no justice. Without power, the poor would remain poor. Without power, the old elites would return. Without power, the revolution would die. So Lenin pursued power, relentlessly, strategically, and sometimes ruthlessly. He used power to give land to peasants, to provide education to millions, to eradicate illiteracy, to raise working-class voices that had been ignored for centuries. But he also used power to suppress dissent, to silence opponents, to centralize authority, and to build a system that future rulers would use in ways that strayed far from his original vision. This raises a profound philosophical question. Can the pursuit of justice remain pure when it requires the use of force? Even Lenin, with all his intellect and determination, could not escape this dilemma. Perhaps no one can. Because power, like fire, can warm a home or burn it to the ground. A life of contradictions. Lenin was a man of profound contradictions. He believed in equality, yet oversaw a government that controlled speech and press. He championed freedom from exploitation, yet justified coercion to protect the revolution. He fought for the poor, yet demanded obedience from political rivals. He imagined a peaceful, cooperative world, yet saw violence as necessary to achieve it. Some see him as a liberator, others see him as an oppressor. Most historians see both, bound together in a single complicated life. And this is why Lenin continues to fascinate scholars, filmmakers, philosophers, and students. He reflects not just political ideology, but the complexity of being human. For every ideal he embraced, there was a cost. For every policy he enacted, there was a consequence. For every dream he pursued, there was a shadow. His story reminds us that even the most brilliant minds struggle with the weight of power, and that even the best intentions can lead to unexpected outcomes. A revolution that outgrew its creator. Lenin shaped the 20th century, but he did not live to see what the century would become. He did not see Stalin's rise to absolute power. He did not see the purges. He did not see the Cold War. He did not see the nuclear age. He did not see the fall of the Soviet Union. And yet, in each of these events, something of his vision, or something interpreted from it, continued to echo. His ideas, released into the world, evolved beyond his intent. Some brought progress, others brought suffering. All carried his intellectual fingerprints. This is the paradox of vision. Once a powerful idea leaves its creator, it can take on a life of its own. Lenin may have tried to guide history, but history rarely follows instructions. The human behind the monument. Today, statues of Lenin stand in some countries, while in others, they have been taken down. His mausoleum remains a tourist site, though many debate what it means to preserve the body of a man whose ideas still spark such intense emotion. But Lenin is more than stone and glass. He is a lesson, a reminder that human beings, no matter how brilliant, cannot control the full consequences of their dreams. He teaches us that power must be handled with humility, that justice must be paired with compassion, that idealism must be balanced with awareness of human nature, and perhaps most importantly, that great visions require great responsibility. What do we do with power and vision? As this story comes to its final chapter, we step back from Lenin's specific life and return to the philosophical heart of bedtime history. Every generation faces a choice about how to use its power, whether that power comes from voting, education, creativity, leadership, invention, or simply the ability to influence those around us. Power alone cannot create justice. Vision alone cannot create fairness. But together, used wisely, they can build something better. Lenin's life shows both the promise and the danger of this combination. Vision can inspire millions. Vision can shake empires. Vision can turn ordinary people into agents of history. But without limits, without dialogue, without humility, that same vision can harm as much as it helps. The question Lenin leaves us is not about whether revolution is right or wrong, or whether his ideas were correct or mistaken. The deeper question, the one that matters for everyone alive today, is this: how do we shape the world without forgetting the humanity of the people in it? The final reflection. As the bedtime history tone gently closes this epic story, we end with a thought that connects the past to the present, and the present to the future. No matter how we feel about Lenin, whether we admire him, criticize him, or struggle to understand him, we cannot escape the truth. We all live in a world shaped by his ideas. Borders were redrawn because of him. Millions were educated because of him. Movements for equality rose because of him. Political systems emerged in response to him. Entire nations defined themselves by embracing or rejecting his vision. Lenin's influence reaches into our textbooks, our politics, our debates, our economies, and our philosophies, even if we do not always see it. He did not merely change Russia, he changed the trajectory of the planet. And so, as the final lines of this long story fade, we return to the quiet, reflective heart of bedtime history. Whether we love him or hate him, support him or fear him, Lenin reminds us of one timeless truth. The world we inherit is shaped by the visions of those who came before us. And the world our children inherit will be shaped by the visions we choose today. This is the eternal question of power and vision, and it is now ours to answer.